having me at your conference. Thank you to the Foundation for inviting me over from Britain, where we are facing a very interesting choice in 5 weeks. We have a referendum on EU membership, and I'm going to talk about that in the second section. Is the economic strategy of the Eurozone viable? Is the Eurozone viable? And I don't need to tell this audience that there are major problems and challenges facing the Eurozone, some of which have been laid out already, and some of which I'm going to add to. Suffice to say that this is an economic area that is facing some very entrenched, very long-term, very deep problems that look distinctly unlikely to be remedied anytime soon. First, we have a noticeable lack of economic growth, which some of the speakers have mentioned, and low projected growth in the future compared to other advanced economies. According to current estimates, the EU, more generally, is projected to grow at around 1.5%, compared to 2.5% for the United States, 6.5% for China, 7.5% for India. But I don't like economic forecasts, largely because in Britain many of our economic forecasts have been wrong in recent history. Let's instead look at reality. In the final quarter of last year, GDP in the Eurozone was still below its pre-crisis peak in 2006. At the same time, the United States grew by about 10%. In fact, last year, the Eurozone was the same size as it had been 10 years ago. Every continent across the world during that period experienced economic growth, except the Eurozone and one other, Antarctica. Secondly, I think it's also important, something that's neglected in the debate, is that that lack of growth has also happened during a time when we've had a dramatic fall in energy prices, and we've had the oil crisis, which in theory should have boosted consumer spending and helped economic development. And secondly, we've had quantitative easing, which should have helped our exporters by keeping the euro down. The fact that those two conditions have not also helped the Eurozone is deeply worrying. But secondly, we also still have entrenched and very high levels of public debt across the Eurozone. Public debt as a percentage of GDP remains stubbornly persistent at over 90% in the Eurozone, around 85% in the EU. Long gone are the days of the Maastricht Treaty when you weren't supposed to exceed 60% of public debt. And third, as some of the other speakers have mentioned, we have a distinct lack of competitiveness among weaker periphery, mainly southern states, and also to some extent in Eastern Europe. High prices and costs have pushed them into larger current account deficits, and as a consequence, they've lost competitiveness, especially against core countries such as Germany. And now we do not have that naturally correcting mechanism which perhaps we would have once had, namely a floating exchange rate. And we've had austerity economics, which has depressed GDP without actually reducing the debt to GDP ratio, which essentially has meant that in some states in the periphery, the value of debt has actually increased, which means that essentially some countries are running faster and faster, but are only standing still, or in some cases are now going backwards. But perhaps most importantly, and for this conference, which is looking ahead, there remains a very clear and a very sharp disparity in the levels of economic development across the EU and the Eurozone states. And this is the part that makes me particularly anxious looking ahead. If you want a sense of what this looks like, take a look at the chart which shows you GDP per capita in 2015. Eurozone states are marked in red. States that are in the EU or closely aligned to the EU, like Switzerland, are marked in grey. And candidate countries that are soon to join the EU are marked in yellow. And within the Eurozone, you can contrast countries like the Netherlands at the top, which have been relatively more successful than others, with Latvia at the bottom, or within the EU, you can contrast Sweden, which has already been mentioned, with Bulgaria at the bottom. It's this disparity that over time produced excessive regulation, the desire for harmonisation, which in turn damaged European societies, and many of those regulations have simply not been particularly helpful for business, or more importantly, for citizens. But now look at the yellow states at the bottom, the so-called candidate countries that are looking to join the EU in the coming years. Montenegro, Macedonia, Albania, Serbia, Turkey. It is hard to see how the accession of those states, which do not even match the performance of those that joined the European Union in earlier years, will help to alleviate the Eurozone's economic problems. If anything, this disparity is likely to fuel further migration from the east to the west. And this is an issue that has been particularly prominent within Britain, where we've had a very interesting debate about what is causing inward migration and record levels of net migration at over 300,000 per year. David Cameron's argument is that that migration has been a consequence of Britain's welfare state, and that those workers are coming to Britain mainly for benefits. I would suggest that actually that significant demographic change is actually more a consequence of what you're seeing on the chart, which is a very striking disparity between the overall levels of economic development across the continent, which are unlikely to be remedied anytime soon. So put simply, what we're looking at is a very different economic reality to that which was initially put on the agenda back in 1957. And of course, when Britain eventually joined the European Union, we joined because we were economic pragmatists. We thought this was going to work, and we were told that this was going to work. Now, of course, I've not even touched upon some of the other challenges that are facing the Eurozone. We can talk about the demographic time bomb that's reflected in low birth rates. We can talk about stubbornly persistent unemployment, which is a reflection of some of these trends. And we can talk about the refugee crisis, which, for example, is estimated to cost Germany over the next year alone around 26 billion euros. And if Germany fails to integrate the vast majority of refugees, then over the next 10 years is estimated to cost somewhere in the region of 350 to 400 billion euros. But I wanted to end by just talking about one other challenge to the Eurozone that has not been mentioned so far at this conference. And that challenge concerns public opinion. And it's perhaps the most important aspect of this debate, and as a political scientist is something I'm particularly interested in, which is, what do the people think? What do the citizens think? And this is where you can see another challenge to the Eurozone. First, large majorities of people now across the continent, unlike earlier years, are openly questioning the viability of the European Union. A clear majority in France, Italy, many other European states now believe that the European Union is no longer moving in the right direction, but is now on the wrong track. The figure in France, over 80%, and these data, by the way, were collected right at the end of 2015. In fact, in France, the percentage of voters who believe that the EU is working has dropped 8 points over the last year. In Britain, it's down by 4 points. Second, clear majorities of people have now become aware of that disparity within the Eurozone and the issue of economic inequality between core states and between so-called periphery states. Majorities now believe that the EU is working unfairly to benefit its more developed members. Almost 60% in 2015 now hold this view, which is up 2 points since last year. So what we are talking about today is clearly registering among European voters. And third, majorities of people also clearly now believe that their national economy has been damaged by the austerity agenda and by EU pressure on Eurozone members to cut their overall levels of spending. In France, almost 80% agree that EU policies have damaged their national economy. That's up 3 points since last year, and puts France only second behind Italy in overall levels of dissatisfaction with how EU policy has been impacting upon their national economy. And last, and by no means least, overall public support for the euro single currency over the past 10 years has been in a slow downward trend. Less than 60% of respondents across the European Union now voice support for the euro single currency. In France, public support for the euro has dropped by about 10 points over the last 10 years. Britain, which is in yellow, and which thankfully never joined the euro, is something of an outlier. And as I will explain to you later on, is actually engaged in a very close race to leave the European Union more generally. So in a nutshell, and in conclusion, there are many deep-rooted challenges to the Eurozone. They are not all economic, some are political, and some are anchored very much in ordinary public opinion. These problems look distinctly unlikely to be alleviated in the near future. If anything, given changes in energy prices, given changes in the political decisions being made at the EU level, they may well get worse in the near future. But with public dissatisfaction rising and support for Eurosceptic parties growing, it is difficult to escape the conclusion that unless something fundamental changes, then the Eurozone is no longer as viable a political project as it once was. Thank you very much.